Today we uncover the shocking truth about Asda UK. Who here remembers when Asda used to actually be a great place to shop? Sure, it was never the best supermarket out there, but for anyone who was looking to feed their family properly without breaking the bank, it was truly a wonderful place. Big trolleys, genuinely low prices, and an own brand range you could actually trust. And even the old staff who seemed to always have enough time in the day to actually help you find what you needed. But now, it's a very different story. This is a company now whose own union has stood outside its stores holding signs that use the word dirty, describing conditions that have gotten so bad they've triggered actual walkouts. A company that a government watchdog caught red-handed, deliberately keeping its fuel prices higher than they needed to be for years, quietly taking extra pennies off drivers who had absolutely no idea it was happening. And a company whose so-called budget food range sparked a genuine national argument about whether it was actually helping struggling families, or humiliating them in bright yellow packaging while quietly hiking the price of the worst quality meat on the shelf. If you still picture Asda as the same value supermarket people used to swear by, the one that actually helped you find bargain prices without making you feel bad about it, well, that picture stopped being accurate a long time ago. Behind the green signs, the rollback stickers, and the constant promise that prices are coming back down to what they once were, sits a business carrying billions of pounds of debt from a takeover it never fully paid for. A business that has quietly rewritten its loyalty scheme so it pays out less than ever. And a business where the ordinary person on barely above minimum wage is left carrying the blame for decisions made entirely by people who have never once had to mop up a leaking chiller themselves. So we've researched and gone through all the latest information about Asda UK and will expose the 10 things you must know before you set foot in an Asda again. Once we're through that list, I'll tell you the handful of things Asda is genuinely still getting right, because to be fair to them, there are one or two. Before we get into the list itself, I want to ask you for something, and I promise it isn't a small ask, even though it only takes a second. Hit that hype button right now, before you carry on watching. I know it can feel like a throwaway gesture, but it genuinely isn't, and here's why. Every single time this video gets hyped, it tells the platform that this information matters, and that pushes it in front of more people who are currently shopping at Asda every single week with absolutely no idea what's actually happening behind the scenes. This channel exists purely because ordinary shoppers deserve to know what these companies are quietly doing while nobody's watching closely enough to hold them accountable. Hitting hype feels like a small action sitting there on your screen. But multiplied across thousands of people, it's genuinely the thing that builds pressure, the thing that makes it harder for a company like this to just carry on exactly as normal once enough people are watching and talking about it. So if anything in the next few minutes makes you angry on behalf of the tired staff member stacking shelves for barely above minimum wage, or on behalf of the family trying to stretch their weekly shop as far as it'll go, hit hype, leave a comment further down telling me your own experience, and let's make sure this information actually reaches the people who need to see it. And let's get into it. Number 10. The dirty Asda phenomenon. The stores themselves and the exhausted staff left carrying the weight of every decision above them. This is the entry that genuinely shocks people, and it only gets worse from here. Because walk into an Asda store lately and you'll notice exactly the same thing shoppers across the entire country keep independently reporting. Stores that feel genuinely run down. Sticky spills left sitting on the floor for far longer than they should be. Trolleys stacked up with nowhere left to put them. Fridges quietly leaking onto the floor beneath them. Shelves that simply don't get restocked the way they reliably used to. The GMB union has stood outside stores in Bristol, in Bournemouth, in Clapham Junction, and in Bexley Heath over the past couple of years, and in every single one of those cases, they've pointed to a specific chunk of hours cut from that individual store's shop floor, ranging anywhere from around 5% right up to as much as 16% depending on the branch, and they've directly linked those specific cuts to declining health and safety standards and increasingly dirty stores. Here's the part that genuinely matters most out of everything we've covered today, though, and it's the part I really want you to sit with. None of this is the fault of the person stacking your shelves, or the person serving you at the till, or the person picking your online order in the freezing cold at the back of the store. Employee reviews left online, over and over again, describe staff earning barely above minimum wage, being expected to do the work of 2 or even 3 people at once, being handed broken or genuinely scarce scanning equipment that hasn't worked properly in months, watching colleagues leave the company and simply never get replaced, all while being told hours are being cut because the business is apparently overspending on wages somewhere else entirely. Even Asda's own current executive chairman, Alan Layton, has publicly admitted that the previous ownership's entire approach to cutting costs ripped the heart out of the colleagues who worked there. Genuinely think about that for a second. The man currently sitting in charge of trying to turn this entire business around is openly admitting the damage was self-inflicted, caused deliberately by the people running things before he arrived. So the next time you walk into a store that feels neglected, tired, or simply not looked after the way it used to be, the anger you feel really shouldn't be pointed at the exhausted person on minimum wage trying their best to help you find what you're looking for. It should be pointed squarely and entirely at the people sitting far above them. The ones who decided year after year that cutting hours was worth more to them than keeping the lights, the shelves, and the floors the way they should always have been kept. Number 9. The customer experience meltdown and the online shopping experience that's turned into a genuine gamble every time you order. If you've placed an order with Asda online recently, there's a real chance that what actually turns up at your door isn't what you ordered in the first place. The most recent survey from Consumer Group, which found around 1 in 4 Asda online shoppers received a substitution in their most recent order. And while that figure is genuinely an improvement compared to previous years, it's still deeply frustrating when you've planned an entire week's meals around specific ingredients and end up receiving something completely different instead. Customer reviews left online describe missing items scattered throughout deliveries, orders that simply don't turn up on the day they were promised, and refunds that take days to process, while you're the one left standing there without the food you've already paid good money for. Some shoppers have described being told directly by drivers that there simply aren't enough delivery vans available for the sheer number of orders being taken on any given day. And Asda has increasingly leaned on third-party couriers for its express delivery slots rather than relying on its own trained drivers. Something shoppers say makes it even harder to get any accountability once something inevitably goes wrong with an order. None of this, on its own, is some huge dramatic scandal that's going to make headlines. But stack enough of these small failures on top of each other week after week, and you end up with a weekly shop that increasingly feels like a gamble rather than something you can genuinely rely on to feed your family properly. Number 8. Just essentials, help, or humiliation. This is the budget range that turned into a genuine national argument all on its own. When Asda rebranded its old Smart Price range into something called Just Essentials, wrapped in aggressive, blinding neon yellow packaging, it triggered a proper backlash that spread right across social media. Critics and shoppers online openly accused Asda of creating what they called a poverty marker, arguing the packaging was so loud and so obvious that anyone shopping on a tight budget essentially had their financial situation announced to the entire queue standing behind them at the till. Asda's own team had to publicly respond to the backlash, stating they don't understand why anyone would feel embarrassed about saving money. A response that honestly says a lot about how out of touch it felt to people actually living through the sharp end of the cost of living crisis at the time. Then, because demand for the range genuinely exploded, Asda started rationing it outright, limiting shoppers to just 3 units of any single Just Essentials product at a time. That meant parents trying to bulk buy cheap staples to feed a large family were physically stopped at the self-scan tills and told to put items back on the shelf. And then came the price creep that stung the most. The range launched its 500-gram beef mince at a headline-grabbing £1.69, genuinely the cheapest meat on any UK supermarket shelf at the time. Within months, that price had quietly crept up to £1.99, suddenly making it less competitive than the equivalent budget mince sitting on the shelf at Aldi or Lidl, when even the supposed safety net range, the one specifically designed and marketed to help struggling families through the hardest years in a generation, starts creeping up in price behind the scenes. You have to ask yourself honestly who this range was actually built to help in the first place. Number 7. The shelves of recalls. In May of 2026, Asda had to urgently recall its own exceptional beer-battered cod fish cakes over concerns they might contain fragments of plastic or metal, telling anyone who'd already bought a pack to check the packaging immediately and stop eating them. The following month, a separate supplier recall over possible salmonella hit fruit pots, sold not just at Asda, but across Waitrose, Marks & Spencer, Morrison's, Tesco and Sainsbury's too, so that particular one is genuinely an industry-wide issue rather than something unique to Asda specifically. But there's an older story that still circulates online today, and it's worth asking why it still gets shared years later. A mum in the Northeast was preparing Just Essentials fish fingers for her 2-year-old when she cut one open and found small hard clusters of fish roe embedded inside the meat. Asda apologized and explained there's always a small natural risk of roe finding its way into fish products during processing, and she was offered a £5 voucher by way of an apology. Now, to be completely clear, that wasn't a formal contamination recall, and roe itself isn't dangerous to eat. But it does raise a genuinely fair question. Why is this the story that keeps getting shared, and why don't we hear the same thing about the other leading fish finger brands sitting on the shelf right next to it? If the biggest, most established names in the freezer aisle aren't producing the same complaints, it starts to look less like an unlucky one-off, and more like a genuine gap in quality control, specifically on the budget end of Asda's own range. And once you start asking that question about one product, it's hard not to ask it about the rest of the Just Essentials meat aisle too. If roe can slip through unnoticed on a production line producing millions of fish fingers a year, what confidence does that actually give you in the mince, the sausages, or the chicken sitting on the shelf right next to it, produced under exactly the same cost-cutting pressure to keep prices as low as physically possible? Number 6. The fuel margin scandal. This is the scandal that quietly cost drivers real money for years without them ever realizing it. For a long time, Asda was genuinely known as the supermarket that kept fuel pricing honest, the one every other chain had to match if they wanted any hope of competing at the pump. Then in 2023, the Competition and Markets Authority told a committee of MPs something far less reassuring. According to the watchdog, Asda's internal profit margin targets on both petrol and diesel had tripled between 2019 and 2023, and in more than 100 petrol stations specifically, places where there simply wasn't a competing supermarket nearby to keep them honest, Asda deliberately applied those higher margins, fully aware drivers in those areas had nowhere else nearby to go instead. Asda was fined £60,000 simply for failing to hand relevant information over to the watchdog on time during its investigation. When Asda's own co-owner was asked directly about all of this in front of MPs, he visibly struggled to give anything resembling a straight answer. For years, you tapped your back pocket and drove straight to Asda because you genuinely trusted it to be the honest, cheap option at the pump. That entire trust was quietly and deliberately taken advantage of, station by station, while nobody outside the company was watching closely enough to notice it happening. Number 5. The year of empty shelves. This is the technology disaster that left shelves standing half empty for months on end. If you've walked into your local Asda over the past year or so and found yourself wondering why entire sections of the store looked stripped bare, you weren't imagining a single bit of it. Asda spent close to £1.2 billion attempting to fully separate its computer systems from Walmart's, an internal project it called Project Future. And the final stage of that rollout went badly wrong through the second half of 2025. It caused genuine, serious disruption to stock availability inside stores and created real friction for anyone trying to shop online during that period. To the point where Asda's own executive chairman, Alan Layton, publicly admitted the mess had set the entire company's turnaround plan back by roughly 6 months. Just sit with that figure for a moment. Over £1 billion spent on new technology, and the end result was barer shelves than the company started with. That's not a small hiccup you shrug off, that's a genuinely enormous unforced error. And ordinary shoppers were the ones left standing in front of empty fridges, completely unaware their weekly order had been quietly cancelled, or their favourite product simply hadn't made it onto the shelf that week at all. Number 4. The £989 million loss and the debt mountain. Asda's own published accounts show a pre-tax loss of £989 million for the year ending December 2025, an enormous jump from a loss of £599 million just the year before that. To be properly fair to them, a large chunk of that figure, somewhere around £656 million, came from one-off costs tied to separating Asda's computer systems from Walmart's and writing down the value of certain properties, rather than representing pure trading collapse on its own. But strip all of that away, and you're still left staring at a business carrying net debt of £3.1 billion, a business cutting prices aggressively in a desperate attempt to win shoppers back from Aldi and Lidl, while its underlying earnings fell by roughly a third across that same period. A business under that much pressure to service debt this size is a business that's going to hunt for savings absolutely everywhere it possibly can. And as we're about to get into, a huge number of those savings appear to be coming straight out of the shop floor itself, out of the hours given to the people actually running these stores day to day. Number 3, the ownership structure and the asset stripping playbook. The debt-loaded takeover that changed everything from the inside. To really understand why shopping at Asda feels different lately, you have to look properly at who actually owns the company, because this stopped being a simple supermarket story a long time ago. This is a story about what happens to a household name once it gets bought using borrowed money rather than money the buyers actually had. Back in 2021, brothers Mohsin and Zuba Issa, alongside a private equity firm called TDR Capital, bought Asda from Walmart in a deal worth almost £7 billion, and a huge portion of that purchase was funded through debt loaded directly onto Asda's own books. Rather than paid for outright by the buyers themselves, in late 2024, Zuba Issa sold his entire stake in the business and stepped away completely, leaving TDR Capital as the clear majority owner, holding 67.5%. His brother Mohsin now holding 22.5% entirely on his own, and Walmart still quietly sitting on a small 10% stake in the background. The GMB union, which represents thousands of Asda staff up and down the country, has stood outside stores in multiple cities over the past couple of years, using the phrase asset stripping to describe exactly what's happened since that takeover. And honestly, once you actually look at the pattern, it becomes genuinely difficult to argue with them. This is close to the identical story that played out at Wilko, at British Home Stores, at Debenhams, at Homebase, and at Poundland. All household names that got loaded with heavy debt under private ownership and struggled badly to recover afterwards. It really is worth sitting with that question for a second. How many more names from our high streets need to disappear or decline this exact way before anyone actually responsible for regulating these takeovers steps in and does something about it? Number 2, the rewards app that quietly pays you less than it used to. Asda used to run one of the more genuinely generous loyalty schemes on the entire high street, handing you real cash into something called your cash pot rather than confusing points you had to work out the value of yourself. For years, hundreds of products marked as star products handed you a straight 10% back the moment you bought them, meaning a big weekly shop could genuinely put a decent chunk of cash back in your pocket. Early in 2025, Asda quietly phased almost all of those star products out entirely. In their place, you now get a permanent bonus specifically on fresh fruit and vegetables instead, which sounds generous on the surface until you actually think it through. Fresh produce is exactly the kind of thing that spoils within days, which conveniently forces you back into the store far more often than a tin of something ever would have. On top of that change, any cash sitting unused in your cash pot now expires after just 6 months, and once you finally convert it into a voucher to actually spend in store, you've only got 30 days before that voucher vanishes completely too. Shoppers have also reported something even more frustrating with online orders. If Asda substitutes an item on delivery day and the total price of your basket drops below the threshold of a mission you were actively tracking, the app simply cancels that reward outright, even though the mission was genuinely live and on track when you built your basket in the first place. It's a loyalty scheme that increasingly asks you to jump through more hoops for pennies rather than rewarding you properly with pounds for shopping the way you always used to. Number 1. The overuse of psychology tricks. The layout trick's built to quietly push your basket total higher. Walk into almost any Asda store, and you'll notice the own brand budget range is very rarely sitting anywhere near eye level. It's either crouched right down on the bottom shelf or stretched right up on the very top, while the expensive name brands sit exactly where your eyes naturally land the second you turn into an aisle. It's an old supermarket trick that plenty of chains use, but Asda leans on it particularly hard right now because it desperately needs your basket total creeping up wherever it possibly can. The trick that catches people out the most, though, is hidden in the spice aisle. Walk down the standard baking aisle and you'll find a tiny own-brand jar of crushed chilies for around £1, weighing maybe 28 grams if you're lucky. Now walk 3 aisles over into the world foods section and you'll find a 200-gram bag of the exact same crushed chilies for around £3. Work out the actual cost per 10 grams, and that little baking aisle jar is costing you well over double what the world foods bag costs you for the identical ingredient. Rice, lentils, dried herbs, turmeric, coconut milk, it's the same story running right across the board. You're not paying extra for better chilies or better turmeric. You're simply paying a premium for the convenience of a glass jar sitting somewhere your eyes happen to land first, and Asda knows exactly how much that convenience is worth to them. So, is there anything Asda is actually still getting right at the moment? To be genuinely fair, there are a handful of things worth mentioning honestly before we close things out today. First, when it comes to big name branded grocery specifically, independent price comparisons carried out by, which have repeatedly found that Asda genuinely does come out cheaper than its rivals on a large basket of branded items, beating both Tesco and Sainsbury's loyalty card prices across the majority of months throughout 2025 and into this year as well. Whatever else is genuinely going on internally behind the scenes, on branded groceries specifically, Asda is still fighting hard on price, and that's a real tangible win for anyone doing a big weekly branded shop and watching every single penny. Second, product availability, which took such a serious hit during all that Project Future disruption we covered earlier, has genuinely climbed back up since then, with Asda's own figures putting current in-store availability back up around 95%, which is a real measurable improvement compared to where things stood during the absolute worst of the technology chaos last year. Third, Asda has actually put real money back into store hours over the past couple of years, with tens of millions of pounds worth of additional investment split across several separate rounds, specifically aimed at improving replenishment and store standards on the shop floor. It's clearly nowhere near enough to undo everything else we've just gone through together in this video, but it does at least show the business knows exactly what the problem is, even if properly fixing it is going to take a great deal longer than a few scattered cash injections here and there. So there you have it, 10 things genuinely worth knowing before you next set foot inside an Asda, and a small handful of things they're still getting right despite absolutely everything else sitting underneath the surface. Cheap prices on their own were never going to be enough to fix broken trust, not when the debt, the fuel margins, the technology chaos, and the state of the stores themselves all tell a very different story once you actually look properly underneath. If any of this has changed how you'll think about your next weekly shop, or if it made you feel angry on behalf of the staff quietly carrying the weight of decisions they never made themselves, hit that hype button right now, because it genuinely helps push this information in front of more people who deserve to see exactly what we've just laid out. Leave a comment down below and tell me what you think, because I genuinely want to know whether you've noticed any of this yourself in your own local store, and let me know which supermarket or which food brand you want us to properly dig into next. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and protect your plate.